Let's do that. All right. I believe we are live. What's up, everyone? We are getting set up for today's live recording with a stranger next to me.
You.
I'll make sure we got all these going out. We are on Facebook. We're on LinkedIn. We are on YouTube. Even the Twitters have live video, crazy enough. And let's go. All right, so we'll have that. So yeah, so for those that are watching, this will be live recording. I will see your comments and things as you jump in. So feel free to say hi or what's up. We will. It's kind of this is the video, of course, will live on YouTube, but we are also recording it for the podcast episode that will be out later this week. So let me make sure I mute our friends in the green room. Let's also make sure I have the banner up for, there we go for that. All right. Gregaryous, ready to rock and roll?
Let's go.
All right. I'm going to kick you back real quick and then we'll do the intro and we'll go from there. What's up, everyone on LinkedIn as well? All right. Let's hit record on the audio. Welcome back to another episode of NFT 365. We are sponsored by the Crypto Business Conference. It is the event for marketers, creators, and entrepreneurs who want to learn more about NFTs and Web3. Excited to have them on board sponsoring these episodes of the podcast. We, of course, are NFT 365, doing this podcast every single day since November 11th, 2021. And of course, number 365 will be on 11/11/22. And one of the things we've been doing recently is highlighting, of course, one of the projects that we've minted recently. But for this episode, I want to kind of change it up a little bit. And I'm going to highlight an actual one of the NFT projects that we minted a while ago. And this is the Angel Alliance. And it was actually our mint from number 137. So mint number 137, about 115 minutes ago, 110 minutes ago. But really innovative project. And actually the person that, kind of brought this one to light to me is actually here. So rather than me talking about it, Greagarious, before we get into the intro, you nudged me about Angel Alliance. There are some cool components of it. I know you've been doing a little bit of work with the team. Can you tell us a little bit about that project, and then we'll get into the intro and the interview and all that fun?
Yeah, absolutely. Welcome, everyone. Glad to be here. So Angel Alliance, I came across, as I was sort of diving into my effort to support more women in NFTs. And Maddie Bergen, who is the founder of the project, originally was doing some working at a VC, noticed how few people were coming in, especially how many women were coming into the flow. And what she did is she said, hey, this seems like a problem that I should fix. And, much as any great startup does, she sort of started out with an initial intention and sort of has iterated. I think her original goal was actually to create an accelerator to fund women-led projects, not necessarily in Web3 alone, but across the board. But what ended up happening is I believe she sort of evolved to a place where she's actually helping to create more VC analysts and actually training them up on how to do the job that she used to have. And I think in that process, bringing more diversity into that mix, getting more points of view up into the fold. And if it goes the way I imagine it could go, I think where it could end up is that she could have this really phenomenal sort of network of people who are scouting and capturing new opportunities and become sort of their own stand-up force, either maybe potentially to deploy out of a traditional VC or maybe as a standalone entity of their own.
Nice. Yeah, I love that. And I actually did see, so March 28th is March 28th, 27th. You gotta love timestamps on Etherscan. It says 1:24 a.m., which for me, that wouldn't surprise me as what time that we minted this collection. But I love the focus on inclusivity and diversity. They also have some innovative things within their solution in their NFT project as well. And the floor price right now is 0.02. So I think there's great project, great potential out there. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that project, of course, and give it a little bit of love. So with that being said, Greagarious, thanks for jumping in. I believe I asked you to be on the podcast, I don't know, 5 months ago, 6 months ago. And we talked about like, we'll do that down the road. We'll make that happen when it makes sense. So talk to people a little bit. I mean, you are not only a serial entrepreneur, but an advisor, someone that, I think we first crossed paths just because your name kept getting mentioned kind of in like the tech stars startup world that we kind of both kind of shared a lot of overlays in. But tell the people a little about yourself and we'll get into a little fun conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So just for background, I started, I'm a repeat entrepreneur, as Fanzo mentioned. I've been building social tools, I guess, I started blogging 2003. So I've been around social and social media, et cetera, for, 20 years now. I did help, I was a VP of product, the first employee at a company called Klout ages ago. A lot of people remember that company. But we sort of measured and tracked influence, online influence. I left Klout though, and then got into Y Combinator, started a company called Shoot, which we sold in 2018. And Shoot was aggregating user-generated content and connecting fans and brands together. And then more recently, did some consulting here and there, different projects, et cetera. But now I am a co-founder and CEO of a company called Zealous, which is a community conversation platform helping to sort of aggregate all the conversations happening around communities into one place to make them, more available, more accessible, and more approachable for members.
So we have to first jump into Klout because you and I have talked about this on the back end. Like I owe a lot to that company from what Klout had done to kind of validate some of the influence that I had early on in the social media space. And I told you this privately, but like, I'm very passionate about the idea of being an influencer. I know some people kind of like will knock it and say, oh, it's a buzzword or it's been ruined. And I like to tell people like, it's paid my bills for 7+ years. Mm-hmm. And early on for me, I was in cybersecurity. I was working social business for, this booming data center company working through social. And as this Klout score, it was an aggregate of, a lot of your, digital interactions. I was running Twitter chats at the time, working with some brands. But I will say for me, it was one of the first kind of pieces where people could tangibly say, like, who is Brian? I remember one of the first lists that I made on that Klout kind of pulled together. It was like top 50 people retweeted by CMOs. And I was number 7. And I remember the amount of like outreach. People were like, who are you? Like, we've never heard of you, but apparently CMOs care of you. Talk a little bit about like the social world at that point and what Klout was doing, because I think it ties a lot into Web3 and like this like deplatforming and organizing information, because in a way, Klout was trying to bring together, in this evolving platform, social media space, a way to kind of manage or monitor or even I would say label certain people and their influence. So can you share a little bit about that and that journey that was back in the day?
Yeah. So, back when Klout was starting, I guess it was 2006-ish or something like that. We were a very Twitter centric world back then, right? I don't think we had influence per se. We started to look at more platforms over time, but it was a very Twitter centric thing. And the way we thought about influence back then, and I still think is a relevant sort of framing today, is your ability to drive action, right? Of some kind, right? So, there's a lot of things like people can get a lot of like visibility, et cetera, but those are that's a factor of like how big your audience is. Can you actually make those people like, do something, influence them to act in one way or another? And I think, it's interesting. One of the big differences, I think, between then and now, though, is we were all doxxed, right? Like there was no, right? You were racing to attach more of your identity to things back then compared to now. And I think this is one of the fundamental challenges ultimately, right? Like for our space as we're evolving, is that, in the Klout age of sort of like social influence. And by the way, a small anecdote, Jody Rich, who runs NFT NYC, started a competitor to Klout called Cred. Right? And so Cred, like our offices were kitty corner to each other also in SF. But, I think like this idea of like understanding who can do what and drive what is really important to humanity, right? Like all of humanity's existence and survival has actually been like based around ultimately like either physically surviving or surviving culturally, like socially together, right? Like, and so I think as we move into this new generation, pseudo-anonymous things still require ultimately like kind of an identity, right? And I think like this is the hardest part about Web3. And I actually think it's a part that, in my opinion, is a little overrated. I think most people aren't really trying to hide themselves per se. I think there's comfort, and I think there's a lot of good reasons why you hide yourself, but I don't think it's the norm, right?
Yep.
You know, when we got into this, like I'm still gregarious, like that's who I am. Like I can't hide myself. And honestly, it's a lot of work to hide yourself, right? Like,
yeah. I mean, that's what I always say. Anyone that's like catfishing someone, or anyone that's like the amount of work to not only hide yourself, but then like to continue to double down in it with every interaction, right? Like when someone, we get some, undoxed people here on the podcast, and they have to have like an extra email address. And if it's attached to like a Google Calendar that might be searchable, all of a sudden I can discover them, right? So it is, that's a good point. Like it's a
significant amount of work. It's stressful, right? Like, but I think back to your kind of earlier question, like I think why this mattered or why we need it, I think what it provided was a framework for actually discovering new people, right? Because like, for example, like folks didn't know who you were, right? And when you think about influence, it's not like this, celebrity is sort of a top level, omnipresent sort of level of influence, but there are celebrities inside of every domain and subdomain and niche within that, right? And it's very difficult to know who those people are, right? Like without software sort of like seeing what our biases don't see, right? Like, so, like you and I are friends, we'll recommend each other as the best people in the space. Is that like definitively canonically true? Maybe not, right? Like, do I know you'll do a good job? Do you know I'll do a good job, right? Like, yes, right? Like we know that to be true. But if it was like we were stacking and pecking, right? Like to figure out like who actually did it, who knows, right? Like, but I believe that the ability to discover new voices, new people, new personalities is actually the most important thing that we should keep doing, right? Because otherwise you just have this classic rich get richer sort of dichotomy, and we have this like, disappearing kind of middle class of, personalities.
Yeah, I think that, that's why I talk about that word serendipity a lot, right? Like, how do we find our people that don't know us, aren't connected, but yet we share that purpose and passion, right? And Greagarious, you and I have become, real fast friends over the last, year and a half plus. We can thank Clubhouse in a weird way for it. Like we were already connected for a while, but Clubhouse a lot, we were interacting on a high frequency, through Clubhouse. Then we both happened to launch a creator coin. Take me back to that, because I've shared it from my journey. We've had Jaffe on the podcast. He has a coin. For me, when I think about those days, it sounds like I'm talking about 2012, and I'm really just talking about 2020, the January, February, March time of 2020. Talk to me a little bit about like your thoughts then on coins, NFTs, crypto. Where was your mindset at as you kind of jumped into this journey? And then we'll kind of fast forward to some of the things you're doing now.
Sure. Yeah. So, Jeremiah Oyang is an old friend of ours. He was the person who brought me sort of into the fold of these things. And I was interested in coins because, I've been building tools that sort of try to understand like, the economies of things. And so I think like having a coin represented an opportunity to test some of these ideas in a more public way, right? These kinds of economies have existed for a while, right? Like we have rewards points with companies. If you're on Twitch at all, you've experienced sort of the Twitch style economies that exist. And I wanted to sort of be able to like deploy that and understand like what effort it took to be successful or not successful sort of in deploying a coin. My coin, by the way, is the AMA coin, the Ask Me Anything coin. And the reason for that was that like, I actually believe questions are sort of like one of the fundamental currencies sort of the world. And it is a way to meet new people, to discover new knowledge, to really unearth things that were going on. When I first set out, the goal, we were building like a Q&A product actually. And so like it was like a Q&A for creators, like, so you could ask them questions. This currency would be used to sort of trade there. We've had different evolutions of thoughts of like where it might go, for example, though, right? And one of the things, kind of like what Maddie's doing is, I wanted to create like a mentor network, right? Like where to help like underrepresented groups and founders. So, as these new projects come up, new accelerators come up, usually the hard part is like getting good mentors, right?
Right.
Having done like a couple of accelerators now, and I have had access to great mentors and folks like that. It makes it really, it's clear how having great mentorship is a powerful tool. So I'd love to see AMA go this way at some point in the future still, which is where we actually create a mentor network where mentors join up and then they accept our AMA coin for time with them, right? And the goal would be then that like programs could just buy these coins and give them to their students. And basically, I want a perpetual economy though, where we just return the coins back to them at the end, right? So it's like, great, buy 1,000 coins. It's a 1 coin per minute thing, and you can book any mentor, and you get a drop-in network of mentors that you can go to.
Nice. So back when that coin kind of came into life and like NFTs, we were on Clubhouse.
Yeah.
Neither one of us have Bored Apes or CryptoPunks, right? So that also just kind of, I think when that whole thing was kind of happening, what was your kind of like aha into this? Because like both of us are early adopters. Both of us think about everything from a business perspective. We are not like flash in the pan. Like I've always respected, like for me, surrounding myself like with people like yourself have always been like, we approach things very similar, right? Like we're not looking for like the quick win, the quick flip. That doesn't say we don't have a hell of a good time degenning and sharing a bunch of nonsense. But what was your kind of like aha into this whole NFT world?
So for NFTs, I think in particular to me, the art side, I guess, my background, like I actually was a designer before. So I've always had an interest in art. So I never had a hard time understanding buying digital art. Like that wasn't foreign to me. But I think for me, the aha moment was really around, and we see the story evolving still, is really around like all the utility that can be stacked, right? And so like the developer in me, what I love about Web3 and NFTs in particular, I guess, is really the composability, right? Like, so it's that idea that I don't need to ask permission. I don't need to create an API. I don't need to expose endpoints. I can literally see stuff and decide to do anything with it. And I'll give you an example. One project that like caught my attention that like I thought was absolutely insane, but that was really interesting was the Klout project, right? And if for folks who aren't familiar, Klout was like literally this black background with words on it, right? I don't know if it was like 7 or 8 words or whatever it was. And if you look at that and you're like, as a piece of art, you're like, you're an idiot if you want to buy that for like 5 ETH, right? Yeah. But what I found really compelling is when you start to be creative and imagine, it's a great way to imagine what composability could be, right? Because suddenly you had this index of words. And if you needed to like say, make a sentence, you had to work with somebody else, right? If you wanted to like prescribe value to it, you had to like find these traits and turn them into things. But the world was infinite that could be built around those words, right? And that was when I first sort of got this glimpse of like, oh, this is really interesting because like, that was the thing that was the most different from like what I bought my first NFT, I think was like I was a visitor. I lost like $400 trying to figure out how to buy Matic and all this other stuff. But I bought a visitor. But my second one, I believe, was like my .eth domain, right? And that made a lot of sense to me, right? Like, but like I buy domain names all the time. Like why I need a .eth per se, I was like, what? I could just attach all that to my DNS records, right? Like, I don't really need a .eth per se for that, right? But the Klout thing really surprised me because I was like, wow, there's like so much imagination you could put into this. And that's when you started to like your eyes open up and you're like, oh, like, well, and then we've seen all these evolutions of new types of utility being like laid out there, from token gating events to like gating content to, obviously like, all the mutant style, like mutations that can happen and all these other things. And I personally love that the idea of creativity that we could continue to apply, right, to sort of like the way technology is deployed over time.
Yeah, because it reminds me a lot of like the design thinking concept, right? Like, and like until I was exposed to what design thinking was, like to me, someone would throw that out there. I'm like, sure. And then I went through like an entire design thinking, like workshop, and I did this project with IBM. And I remember the idea of like, if we remove the constraints of like kind of the biases that we have and the way that we've always kind of visualized things, like how does that change or impact the way that we think? But, you also mentioned within there, right? Like your, design background, startup background, working, in multiple startups, starting up your own. You also have a dev background. You also happen to be kind of a weightlifter, right? There's a hidden side there of, do you identify yourself as like that multi-hyphenate like that? I mean, I think that is for sure, but I think how does that attach to entrepreneurs? Like, are all entrepreneurs in your mind have that like multi-passionate, multi-hyphenate gene? Because I mean, you have it across the board with your skill sets that you tap into. I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't think so per se, right? So I do think that to be a good entrepreneur, and this goes for every NFT founder out there or anything like that, you have to be prepared to eat a lot of glass, right? And that often means learning or doing things that you are not optimal at, but doing them because you want to succeed, right? And so to me, being an entrepreneur, you most often you see a world that you want to create, right? And so you are willing to walk over lava and eat all the glass in the world to make that happen, right? Now whether or not that's a smart idea or not, like that's a separate discussion. But I do think like what ends up happening is the way I picked up these skills, I got into med school actually, right? Like I was like pre-med sociology degree, took one programming class in college, right? Back then it was Pascal. We were the first year doing Pascal instead of
shout out to Pascal. Right? How about that? I took that as well. So
right. But but the thing is, the reason I learned these skills was because as an entrepreneur that didn't have a lot of capital to do things, someone had to do the design work. So I was interested in art and I did design since I was younger. So I was the designer. And then I learned to code watching our partner that was the developer code what I made or designed. And that's how I learned how to code. So I picked these skills largely because I needed to. But the secret is to learn how to let go of the things you're not good at, right? Yeah. And sort of get into other areas. So I think there are a lot of multi-hyphenate entrepreneurs. I would argue probably that most of them are not actually though. Like they're really good at one thing and they dabble or do the other things long enough to get it going and then they hand it off somewhere else, right? Like right now, I wouldn't sell for money like almost any of the underlying skills I have, right? Like I would never charge someone to design something for them. Right. I wouldn't charge them to code something for them, right? Like because I know these things largely to protect myself, like so that I can get the things I want done, but not because like it's a service or something or expertise I sell anymore, right? Yeah.
So I'm curious from, one of the things that I've always struggled around was like, for me working in the corporate world and then working even in the startup that I work at, for 5 years, people would be like, Brian, I can't believe you haven't become an entrepreneur yet. Brian, how have you not worked for yourself yet? And like, I remember feeling like this, like immense amount of pressure from the outside of, and like, it was even my bosses that I worked for in the companies I worked for would put that like kind of like, Brian, you're just natural for that. And like, little do they know, like my dad been an entrepreneur his entire life. I understood some of the nuances, but for me, there was like this scary alternative of lots of responsibility for a lot of things that I didn't have experience on. But then there was also this idea of like, I really loved what I was doing for the companies I worked for. Like I'm very blessed. I can literally say I worked for a 25,000 person government contractor. I worked for a 200 person startup. I worked for a startup. I was employee 11. I liked all three of those jobs, loved all three of them. But, then, jumping into entrepreneurship or even getting kind of pushed into entrepreneurship, one of the things that I've struggled with is that idea that like everyone should be or could be or can be or might be an entrepreneur. And the reason I think that's so important in this conversation is it's bleeding into everyone should launch their own NFT collection. I mean, 3 emails today today on the recording day. The email started, Fanzo, I love what you're doing in NFTs. I've got, and I was like, oh God. I was like, and they're author and speaker friends. And right. If you're listening to this, I love you all. But it's also like are we seeing this as kind of like that entrepreneur side where it's like, oh, it's the thing that everyone's telling me to do or everyone says I should do. How do you kind of present that as someone that advises and been through that? How do you connect like that pressure that I think a lot of people, and we can blame Gary Vee a little bit in the sense where like, everyone should go sleep on your friend's couch and right. And go intern somewhere for free. But in all seriousness, like there is something I think fundamentally where we have to like frame things in ways that set people up for success without it having to be like a zero-sum game. How do you kind of wrap your head around that whole kind of idea?
So I think there's a difference between, I think entrepreneurship is is a thing that most people have in them, right?
Okay.
But whether or not they are entrepreneurs is a different thing, right? Like everyone can be enterprising, right? Everyone can be aspirational. And I think those are, everyone can be optimistic. And I think those are important characteristics and traits that almost all entrepreneurs have to have, right? But not everyone is persistent, right? Not everyone has perseverance, right? Not everyone has like the grit to sort of suffer, right, through a lot of these things. And so I personally believe, and you know, as we were building, like, for example, Zealous, we were working with creator economy. And my goal was to try to make more creators successful on their own. But to your point, not every creator wants to be an entrepreneur, right? Like, just like every person starting an NFT doesn't want to be. But I think the better way to think about this is more, if you are going to do the thing, it is better for you to recognize yourself as an entrepreneur than not, right? So you can't like say, I want to do an NFT project and I'm just an artist. No, now you are a business person, right? Like you have all of these roles that get embroiled into that. And so I think like that earlier point about like how you pick up all these skills, you have to do a bunch of things you don't want to do. If you can't bring yourself to do that, then you can't succeed. Right? I'm not saying you have to individually do it, but you have to have a partner who's going to do marketing. You have to have somebody who's willing to deal with customers if you don't like dealing with customers, right? You have to have someone who's willing to do the technical parts if you're not, you know, technical, right? Like, so suddenly you are now managing this whole thing. And guess what? You're a founder, right? Now, whether or not you like that, like, is really dependent about how successful you're going to be, right? Because I'm not saying everyone needs to be an entrepreneur, but I am saying that if you decide to do an enterprise, right, you are now an entrepreneur, right? Now, you don't need, I think if you don't want to do all those parts, to your point, right, then go join a project, go support a project, go contribute the part that you're good at. You'll get to be part of that team still, right? But you don't want to be the lead. Right? Because being the lead has a whole bunch of other problems and challenges and things associated with it. So I don't want everyone to be entrepreneurs. Well, actually, look, personally, I think everyone should be entrepreneur, right? Because I think it maximizes your opportunity, your freedom, your mindset, right? Like all these other things, you get to have full control over those things. But as everyone knows, having full control over things is generally a bad thing, right? So that's why most people don't want it, right? And I think if you're not that kind of person who's like, you know, like I wake up in the morning, and for me, you know, the most succinct way I describe how I, you know, the difference, for example, between me and my wife, right, is she's like very organized, very, you know, sort of like A-type personality, and to me, everything is, there's always a solution. I'll figure it out. Nothing can like knock me down. Like nothing is going to like literally get in the way. If you can't embrace that idea over and over again, you're probably going to have a hard time being an entrepreneur, right? Because the world is working against you, right? Like success in entrepreneurship is a very rare thing. And so, you know, most people aren't going to achieve it, right? Like, and so that is unfortunately 95%, 98% or something like that of startups fail. Right? Like not because they're bad people or not because like they were, you know, didn't know what they were doing. Like you could do everything right, but you have bad timing, you'll fail. Right? Like you could do everything right, and then some externality happens, like a recession or something else, you fail. Right? Like, so it's not always that you did something wrong. Right? Like, you know, sure, maybe you like have a fortune tell, you could have a ball to see the future, but most of the time that's not true.
So I'm curious now, and you know, because like in this world of like content creation, and you mentioned about creators, but you also mentioned like kind of the mentors, and we talk about like kind of building the people around us. For a lot of people that I know that are listening right now, they're like, Brian, I'm a believer. I was collecting first. I now know the project I want to create, but I can't find the developer or the artist, or where do I go find? And like a lot of people are at that spot. Yeah. I think there's also equally amount of people that are like, I would love to either be a mentor or have a mentor. How do you kind of attach both of them when people are kind of in that spot where you're like, I don't want to do everything myself. I want to, but like, where do people go? How do you get people to kind of over that hump of like, I want to, but I don't know where?
Well, one, I think it is the best test, right? Because if you can't get over the hump, right, then it means that you're not really in it enough to figure it out, right? And this is like when you talk to any venture capitalists or anything else, they want to see how much you can get done on your own, right? Like with minimal resources. Now, practically speaking, if you are a developer, you probably have the easiest time finding work. That's probably not going to be the hard part, right?
That's true.
If you're a designer, you're a social or whatever, one of these other functions, you've got to get involved, right? You have to go participate. You have to put yourself out there. You need to build a resume. You need to build a portfolio, right? You have to go do the work, right? But this is like career advice. This is not like anything special to any of this stuff, right? Like what I've switched careers a couple, not like really switched, but like, for example, I went from being like building automotive CMSs, like in one day to like building social tools. And that was a reboot for me. Like I had to build a whole new network of people. I had to like learn a whole bunch of new concepts and like steep myself in a bunch of things. And it is only by like burrowing through it that you sort of figure it out, right? I will advise though that most people shouldn't be mentors, right? Because being a mentor is it requires a lot of experience. Now, generally though, I believe that you could be a mentor for the person in the phase right before you, right? So,
right. Yeah, true. Very true.
Right. Yep. Like everyone could be a mentor relative to that, but being a standalone, like, mentor is a really difficult thing in life, right? Like you have to have a diverse set of experience to know how to help sort of anyone, and no one can help anyone in general. Right. But, within a domain or something like that. So I would say like offering your advice is actually not the best way to learn, because you're not taking feedback. And the problem with that, like that one-way thing doesn't teach you anything. No. Right? Like, so what you really need to do is become like a subservient to a process, right? Like you need to be a contributor or, something else. I think you learn a lot more in that way, right? Or be a teacher, not a mentor, right? Because a mentor is like a one-way thing, right? But when you're a teacher, you only succeed in teaching when someone learns the thing that you actually are trying to teach them. That is an interactive process. That can get you a lot further. So go teach the skills that you have to somebody who doesn't have them, pick up some skills that they have. And that's the way I think that you ladder up, because now you have a pair or a buddy or a little group and you start to become self-sufficient.
Yeah. And I think that collaborator element, right? Where people, there are tons of projects right now that, that are looking for the skill sets that a lot of people say, like that you have right now. And the idea that you can, even like, volunteering your time to provide them to solve that problem exposes you to their network and their internal, right? And that's such a big player. The other part of this is like this constant need, content creation, content management. And I know, when you first, mentioned Zealous to me and what you were kind of working on, for me, there's, I'm very blessed. I get a lot of tools thrown at me, a lot of software thrown at me. And I think for me, when I look at lots of options, I'm always like, I can have everything, right? Like this morning when I logged in, like I had Adobe Creative Suite up. I had literally Final Cut was running like on my computer, and I was laughing because I'm using GarageBand as like the tool that I'm using, right? So like I have a lot of tools, but I find like, simplicity in ones that I'm managing. But then there's also this idea of like, where do we go into this like automation meets kind of like scalability and like in that creator economy? And I know for, many of my friends, especially like YouTubers, podcasters, authors, speakers, a lot of them understand the importance of content creation, understand and value the importance of telling their story. But there's that weird spot of like, they don't want to really create, and the idea of like documenting, which we can give, Gary Vee did a really great job, I think, of bringing that to light for a lot of people. How did that kind of like influence kind of where Zealous has kind of gone to? And talk to us a little bit about Zealous, because I think for a lot of our community, it's giving me a little bit of an aha for them on what you're actually kind of building that's going to fit into their kind of tool suite.
Sure, absolutely. So you used a great word. Like I think we're too used to thinking about content, and I would prefer that. And this was a big unlock for me, I guess, like in building Zealous, is to stop thinking about content and start thinking about conversations, right? And so if we reframe the way we think about anything, you write a post, you're not writing the post for the sake of the post. You're writing the post to inspire thought and hopefully to foster some kind of conversation with an audience or with your members or whatever it's going to be. And so if we stop using that word content, right, and we start replacing it with the word conversation, right? Now, all of the things that a traditional content marketer, all the things in the fold, our social media posts, our podcasts, right, our Twitter spaces, et cetera, what they really are two-way things, not one-way things. Now, this is a hard thing for a lot of people to get to your point about scale, because even though we know it's a two-way thing, like we might get comments on it or something like that, we don't appreciate it as a conversation. We look at that as like servicing the content, right? And I think that like the big mindset shift that we had when we were building Zealous, especially to where we've gotten now, is that communities are conversations, right? And to me, like conversation is the ultimate utility in the NFT world, right? Because everyone can offer it, right? You can constantly get better at it. You can involve as many or as few people as you want in it, right? And conversation drives everything. It drives future content, right? It drives commerce. It drives collaboration. It drives connections between your people, right? So everyone offers content first, right? What we're doing at Zealous is saying like, hey, you're having these conversations in all these different places, and that makes it really hard to follow, right? And so at Zealous, we only deal with produced content basically, right? So like, for example, if you have a Discord with a bunch of chat, I consider most chat to be noise, right? And what I know is just that from a pure design pattern, that if you bothered to record it, it likely meant more than the things you didn't record, right? So if you have a Twitter space and you didn't record it, great, try rambling, right? If you have a Discord room, but it's game night and like, you're like, great, there's no secondary value, there's no other way to participate, great, doesn't matter. But if you recorded it, it meant that there's a conversation that you wanted to have with more people. And the thing we observed with Zealous was that you have 100 something thousand followers on Twitter, you have a space, and then you have 300 people show up. Well, what about the other 105 or 10,000 people that couldn't make it, right? And I think that that's a shame and a big opportunity for community managers, leaders, organizers, et cetera, to not be so exclusive such that your time zone is a penalty, right? We have global audiences now, global memberships. We can't be doing things where like the only way that you can be in it is if you can like stay up till 4 a.m. or quit your job so you could be there all the time. That's not fair. It's not equitable. And we want to change that.
And it's going backwards because, you know, for all the Gen Zers that don't remember this, like I had to beg my parents to stay up till 9 p.m. on Wednesday nights in high school because that's when 90210 was on. And I had to literally be good. And I remember telling this on stage one time and someone's like, well, why did you have to stay up till 9 o'clock? Couldn't you have just watched it the next day? I was like, I could have, if I could have figured out a VCR, programmed the VCR tape in there, got it to actually record because those things were literally probably still to this day, one of the hardest texts ever to schedule. But isn't that interesting? Like the idea where we're like, hey, if you're not in the Discord at this time, or if you're not in our Twitter space from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m., you can't consume it. Yet the rest of our media entertainment, we've moved to an on-demand model with everything on that, right? So I'm so glad you kind of tied that in there. I also love that you mentioned like conversations versus like kind of that noise, right? Where some of it, like the back and forth, and it's even why like I hate email. I love conversations, right? And it's because email never has ever for me felt like a conversation, right? Like, and like in a weird way, I think you and I even talked about this previously, like Google Wave, when that was coming out, I loved the concept because I was like, wait a second, you're going to create a fluid conversation through my email. But of course, Google never brought that to light. It kind of died. So that idea, okay, conversation. So I think for a lot of people, they can see that light. But now it's more of like, well, okay, does that need to change the way I am recording things? No. And how do I get that information to them? How do you?
So great point. And that, by the way, just a little anecdote. Someone I forgot who said this. Someone told me like your inbox is somebody else's to-do list for you.
That's good. Yep, that's so true. And I don't like being told what to do, so no wonder I don't like my inbox.
But yeah, to your point right now, I think so. The first part is the first problem we address with Zealous is like the availability of the content, right? Like, hey, why isn't it easy to find it? Why isn't it easy to sort of get to it or to get there? The second part is the accessibility, right? And this is to your point where you mentioned automation earlier. This is where we actually help a lot, right? So we look at accessibility from two different points of view. One is the format, right? So and the second is the language, right? So number one, format, right? Different people have different learning styles, right? You deal with like neurodiversity, right? Like some people need to read things, some people need to hear things, some people need to see, like, right?
Yep.
We rob people of the best chance to participate by not giving them that content in multiple formats, right? And so that's what we do like at Zealous is we take like, you know, your audio based space, we turn it into a video and we turn it into text. And so now however you are best set up to understand or comprehend that data, you have access to it. Of course, this also deals with disabilities and other things. So it improves the ability to have a conversation with more people, right? It widens the net. The language part is the new part that we're about to start working on soon. But that also lets you say, if you're a native Spanish speaker, and my community is like 1/3 Spanish, right? Well, you know, I hear Discord operators all the time, like they're like, should we add this other channel in another language? But then they're like, we don't really have that like expertise in house. And the problem is that when it's chatter, you can't do it. But when it's for something important, like this workshop, a webinar, whatever it is, it's worth getting it into that other language. And so by creating more of these artifacts, what we're doing is making it more more available to more people in a way that they can actually understand it better.
So when you think of that, like for me, the content management systems are things I've dealt with since I worked at the government, right? So, and we were trying to, we were deploying SharePoint. I mean, anyone that knows SharePoint should feel bad for me just because that's what I was deploying. And if you are still listening to this and you work for the DoD, I apologize for the SharePoint versions that we put out to the world, although it's way better today than it was whenever I was deploying it. But, you know, content management as a whole, I've always felt like it's either built for the search engine optimization of like random discovery, or it's built in such a way that is in like, you have to know the secret way of kind of cutting through the noise, right? Like anyone that's like logged into some of those things, you're like, what combination of search, like I need to use something in parentheses plus, you know, and like kind of figuring that out. How are you looking at that? Like kind of like the discovery of content, the searchability of content, and really kind of where it plays into the future of SEO, into this web.
Yeah. So I think, I think we optimize for humans, not machines. Right. And so we have a lot of text content kind of by default for everything we make. So hence inherently there's like good SEO value here. However, we allow for gating of that content. So a lot of it may not even be available, right? Like, because it's like behind a paywall or an NFT or something else, right? But what I do care about is how quickly can a person make their way through that content, right? You know, and so, and how quickly can they find it? So there's features coming, right? Like, but like full text search, like for any conversation that's actually been found. Great. I'm looking for this word, filtering down for a specific person. Cause I know Fanzo said it. Can I find just where he was talking? You know, we built in, for example, like a highlight reel so that people can like say, this was an important moment. This was an important moment. This is an important moment. And what it generates is actually the short list. So you don't have to actually read or listen to the 3-hour space. You can listen to just the 15 moments that were clipped out by someone who paid attention. Right.
Nice.
We have a feature coming soon where we're going to allow playlists. So like you can curate out like 5 or 10 moments and annotate it like in your own way so that you can actually provide like some context around it. And all of these are ways to repackage because people ramble, right? Like, so, you know, like 2-hour space, you know, every space, you can probably cut the first 15 minutes off just because everyone's still introducing themselves. Right. And then you get into like, and then even in there's like 1 or 2 moments. We want to try to make it as efficient as possible to find those 1 or 2 moments, because I believe that if you really want people to participate, you have to make it so that they can see where they should participate as quickly as possible.
Well, and let's face it. I mean, I made it through high school and college with Cliff Notes. I mean, I have no shame in my game to this point, where I was the guy that go, like the teacher would say what books we're reading this year, and I would be the one that would run to the local bookstore to buy like you can read these 15 pages and consume the 300-page book. And I will say, like, at the time, I thought like it was like a shameful approach to what I was doing. Little did I realize, like, my brain operates a hell of a lot better. And if the goal of reading the book was to get us to understand these concepts, and I could do so in 15 pages because it was built for me, why the hell was I not like, you know, set up for that? Right. Like, it's such an interesting subsection. And like what you're saying there also is like, we should be able to cut through what the quote unquote noise is. And I still believe the hardest part of this whole content conversation game is getting the right information to the right people at the right time. Creating the content, putting the stuff out there. That's easy. I mean, to me, press the damn button, right? Like literally it's that easy, but it is about like filtering it, getting it to the right people at the right time. I love that approach with what you're doing with Zealous.
Well, and the power here though, Brian, is that previously this was like command and control, right? So brands want a highly curated experience, and we're going to push it out, and it's going to be fully polished, and 1,000 millennials are going to look at it before like it hits, the internet, right?
Right.
Now we have the community, though. We have the listeners to be part of that experience, right? So if you think about like Goodreads, right?
Yep.
That's the modern equivalent. It's like, let me read the highlights that other people highlighted from the Kindle book that I don't have enough time to go through, right?
Yep.
That experience, and by the way, we have a combination of humans and AI, right? So we can use AI to do like auto summarization. We can find sentiment analysis. We can determine interesting peaks. We can use the emoji data from Twitter Spaces to find out where people were really reacting, right? So there's a lot of signals that we can get, but the best part is the humans, right? Like someone just goes through and is like, oh, that was like, I know like your team is taking track of like moments that are interesting. They'll be able to go to Zealous Transfer, just highlight those 5. And now if someone wanted to just spend 5 minutes listening to this combo, they would listen to just those parts. And that would give them a lot to know whether or not they want to invest the other 40 minutes to like, say, pick up the rest of this thing or the whole thing.
Well, and I've been a big believer. I mean, this is my 8th podcast, and a lot of them I've done live video. We're recording this live, and I mean, like the traditional podcast haters would come to me and be like, "You're cannibalizing your audience, Fanzo. Like, what are you doing? Why aren't you getting them? What are you doing? Open that on live." And like for me, it was always like, "Hold on, like." I don't care where or how someone chooses to consume my content. If they're giving me their time, they can pick and choose. And I've also always strongly believed that if you give people different entry points into trust you, it doesn't matter what that entry points are. They'll find their way to like what your value is. The other thing you brought up was kind of like the gated piece, right? And I will kind of summarize for those here at the end that are like wondering if Zealous might be something for them. We'll talk about that at the very end. But you mentioned like the gating, and in this Web3 world, I think right now it's a very I'd say lost art at the moment of understanding what should be gated, what should not be gated, what does even token gated mean? And I will say, like, I think a lot of brands really did this bad through Web 2, right? Where there were things where you would click on it and you get halfway through an article and you're like, I gotta pay. How do I get the rest of that, right? Or it would be the other way where they would just give you that generic blog post with a link that says, click here. And then that was gated for something. And most of the time it was, they want your email address. Like, let's face it, that's how it worked. Yeah. But that was because we needed an entry point to follow up and then get them into our funnel. How is token gating kind of changing that? And how are you looking at it from a idea of like what we're gating, how we're getting it, and like kind of that where that lives?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's a moving target, obviously, right? But what I've observed so far is that most projects are offering a hybrid approach between like what I'll call premium content and public content. Right. And so, the public content may be the stuff that we do on Twitter Spaces. It's sort of where it's like, get to know the vibe of our community here, like from our team, hear from other members potentially. Right. I actually look at, I have a pipeline that I use to talk about sort of like how conversations flow. At the top level, these public content is really serving the purpose of like building audience. Right. That middle tier is the community tier. And that's where you have more like, like we close it off because what we don't want are people who aren't aligned with the passion or the vision or the mission, right? Because like, it's always easy for someone to come in and be an a-hole, right? And just like, basically, just like throw barbs or FUD things like for no good purpose. But that's like that premium layer, right? Like that community layer. And the premium may be buying an NFT. It may be just like you need to be invited, like whatever the gate is really, I think, it could be like, you have to be an owner of our product, right? Like we plan to integrate Shopify. So as long as you got a receipt, right? It means you're on the team. Right? Like that's as little as what a gate could mean. Right. But I think what you get to that premium tier is really about helping connect people to each other. I was listening to your show the other night, and you were talking about sort of the audiences. The one Saturday, you recorded Saturday, but it was like, and I think it's like the difference is moving between an ecosystem of dots to an ecosystem of lines. Right. And the dots are just nodes, right? So networks, I know when you were using the analogy, like a node, like it's like, okay, great. Like that's one dot. But a creator and their audience is also a dot, right? Like, because it's really just like everyone's around this one dot. In communities, it's about the lines that connect them, right? And so the strength of a community is actually about how many lines there are, right? Not how many dots there are, right? So, you take your Discord, 10,000 people, but there's 100 inside, you have 100 lines, right? You got 10,000 dots. Nobody cares about the dots because the dots don't show up all the time, right? So I think like when you look at gating, it's about incentivizing investing. Right. And it's about being there with the right mindset. right? Like, it's like when you're like, well, great. Are you the kids who sit in the back and because you're required to be at that thing, or are you kids in the front row because you want to take notes, right? And I think that's how communities are using the gating to some degree, right? Is like, premium content, like we're going to do a webinar, a workshop, we're going to teach you up into a thing. And I think that that's a really important part of the process. Now, the other reason for gating, and it's the third pillar of Zealous actually, is around the approachability of this content, right? Because I don't think that these conversations work if they're still one way.
Yep.
So we built a lot of tooling in where you can like and comment and do other actions around the content and actually participate in it just like you were there. Now, why this is really important though, right? Like it's a very simple thing, is that if me and you were in a room, the only two people they'll probably hear is me and you, right? Because we have big personalities,
right?
We're out, we talk, right? People come and ask us to talk, right? Whatever it's going to be, right? But there's a lot of people who like maybe don't have the courage to come and like open their mouth in front of other people. They're scared of public speaking. They're scared to ask their question because they might be ridiculed or whatever it may be. Sometimes they need time to think about and digest the content before they formulate how they want to ask the question, or et cetera. Right. And so by making this content approachable where I could participate in it after the fact as well, that becomes a really critical part of making more lines as opposed to more dots. Right now, gating helps to make sure that only the right people are there, right, to even do that. And then I think over time, what we'll see is more Klout style, karma style systems introduced into the ecosystem to say, well, not just having the NFTs enough, but like you had to have been here. You had to have participated. You had to be like a contributor, and people had to like actually think what you're saying is good, because that's the kind of people we want to encourage and foster more and more.
And I think that's actually some of that magic of how the combination of NFTs and coins end up working, right? Because you're able to kind of build that upon it. I also love that, the touch point on like the more lines, right? And it's more lines to more people, right? Because I think a lot of quote unquote communities that get stuck in the, there's only lines to one or two or three active voices. And the other part that, is really important on this whole gated conversation is a lot of it is also to protect the individuals that are getting the courage to ask a question or to be vulnerable, because it's not, I get a little frustrated when people say this is a safe space. Well, is it a safe space? Because I believe you're just publicly on Twitter that any Yahoo can come up and raise their hand and say anything in the world, right? So like, what does that really mean? So I love
but what
does
safe mean, right? Safe from what? Like safe from like differing opinions, or like safe from being personally attacked, right? Like, you know,
or safe from being, because like, I mean, and that was the thing with us on Clubhouse for a while. Like we were doing a lot of those mental health spaces, and like we curated, like you had to have a phone call with us before you could come up and ask our question. And people were like, well, Brian, you're defeating the purpose of Clubhouse. I'm like, well, no, we're validating the premise that we are building a safe space where we are understanding the context that they're asking the question and making sure that we're, kind of setting that landscape. So I love that you kind of touched on each of those kind of characteristics. Where you're at now, like, the idea of, Twitter spaces, you mentioned like turning, social audio into video and written. What about like kind of like let's say the video interview side to that way? Or what about like the blog post, right? Person that's writing blogs that way. How are you looking at like all of the different content creation types to kind of manage the conversations with Zealous?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think we're pretty focused on produced media today. We could technically read, a blog post into audio and turn it into a video if you wanted. I think, and there's value in that, obviously, right? Like, for folks who are blind, for example, right? But there is also technology to solve for that. But I do think I'm a fan of like the richness that audio and video provides us, right? Because it allows for a lot more nuance. It allows for a lot more compassion, and it allows for a lot more empathy, right? Because, you hear someone's voice, if they're being an a-hole or if they're being sincere, right? And and the same three words can come out like 100 ways, right? Like, and I think that's why like we tend to focus on this type of media because it's very efficient for sharing your thoughts, and getting out what you want to say, right? A lot of people are not good writers, right? Like, or they feel they're very self-conscious about like writing things. Most people don't write long form to begin with, right? They certainly have no handwriting skills. And I write like in a block letter, like a third grader at this point.
Yeah, so do I.
Right? So, so I think like we're pretty focused on rich media. because I believe, like I said, in the lines, right?
Yep.
I think when you do things in isolation, it's more dot work, right? And so that's like, like writing long form posts to me, I don't think it's going away, and I don't think it's a bad format. I just think it's not the medium that we want to focus on, right? And I think most people would be better served not procrastinating, writing the long form thing if they just get out and say, I'm thinking about this thing, and just uttered it out, right? Like, and it doesn't have to be well formed, because I think this fake polish that everyone is sort of like gotten used to expecting and wanting, right? I think we don't need it, right? Like humans are not perfect.
TikTok's proving, like, literally they are proving the fact. TikTok has literally built an algorithm that says, oh, you overproduced that, jump cut the hell out of it, spent 4 hours in that video, we're going to show 200 people because 200 people care. Oh, you just did a one-shot take and you were, passionate, looked in the eyeballs, we're going to let 400,000 people, right? TikTok literally is proving that.
And that's what I think. I think we need to get back to talking to each other. We need to get back to seeing each other, right? Like, I'm not forcing it on people. Like, I'm just observing naturally occurring things, right? Like Twitter Spaces happen not because of us. They were just happening. Zoom calls, Discords, webinars, all these other things are happening. We're focusing on that type of content first, right? There's maybe a chance, like maybe an opportunity to work with more other formats. But I don't think we need to. Like, there's so much work to be done in this arena. Most podcasts today are still one-way experiences, right? Like,
it's been my biggest complaint about podcasts. I mean, and even when podcasts create a Twitter account, they just dump the link to the episode, don't reply to comments, and I mean, it's been to me that's and I will say, I always called it participatory content, right? Like, I love participatory content, right? It's why live video is always attractive to me. It's why Twitter Spaces and Clubhouse was attractive to me, because it is that multi-way. Even if there's not a lot of people coming on stage, there are people giving me nonverbal feedback, the emojis on Twitter Spaces. And I think, to your point, like, that is also a spot where I think we allowed, like, the TV media production world to skew what we thought YouTube should be and what we thought Facebook should be. But if we scrape all that around, like, why do we love networking events? Why do we love sitting on the front porch with a friend drinking a beer and hearing a story? Because we get all of the context. It's very unpolished, and it's real and raw. And I think you're right. I believe a beauty of coming out of the pandemic, a beauty of what Clubhouse exposed to many of us was, we want intimacy, vulnerability, authenticity, transparency. Well, those four things best live in participatory content, much more so than produced.
That's right. And like, the great thing with Zealous now is we'll turn this feature on soon. You just give us your RSS feed. We'll make it two-way by default. Like, we'll just ingest it and we'll add the transcript, and then I'll all be interactive. Right. And what's powerful about that, I think, also is, you ever get one of those emails where you write like 1,000 words or something, and then just some idiot replies, I don't get it. Right. I'm like, really? Right. With us, you're always replying to what someone said. And by preserving the context of like what they're reacting to, you actually can better reply. Right. It saves you time. It saves everyone frustration. And hopefully it gets you back to a resolution or a collaborative place, like, faster.
Well, I mean, I'm a huge Google Docs fan, right? And when it used to be read this and send me an email with your review, that's a nightmare of back and forth, right? Versus, let me highlight an inline comment what I care about. Like, medium.com has done that really, really well, right? Where all of a sudden they change the narrative on blog replying, right? And I think that component here is so important, especially if it's something delivered via audio and, like, sometimes missing out that context. So I love that part. So Zealous, you've been capturing all the Twitter Spaces that I've been a part of since, I think, all the way back in February, right? So we have all of them captured up on we'll link, and we'll all the links, of course, will be in the notes below. But for those that are listening that are, like, wondering, like, is Zealous for them, or what are the next steps, or how does that work for them? Give them a little bit of, like, that component of what they should be looking for, or
So Zealous has two sides to it. One is just the pure listener side, right? And that everyone can sign up for that. And when we launch, it'll probably be about September. We're about to push our new release actually up later. Probably by the time this podcast is live, you'll be able to go and sign up for Zealous. But when we do launch it, the listener experience is going to be really like, connect your wallet, follow the projects you want, and just listen to them, right? And so we want to make sure that, like, all the NFT communities out there that are putting out great content, like that, all of that content is going to make it to their members automatically. We do that by basically following all the Twitter spaces for all of those NFT projects automatically, back them up, and then share them back to you in a Spotify style experience where you can just listen. So if you consume this content, we're probably a great place or way for you to consume it, because you can time shift it and do all the other things that you want. So I think everyone can be a user of Zealous on that part.
Right.
Now, if you're a content creator or conversation creator, let's say, right? Like where you are, participating or creating or hosting spaces, you have a podcast, you're a creator in one form or another, or a community organizer. There's a different way to use Zealous where you can then put your proprietary stuff into here as well, right? So when people sign up now, they get Twitter Space for free. If you want to have like your podcast come in, then you sort of switch to, eventually you will have a paid plan. You'll like level up to get to like one of those plans so that you can like include third-party content. But our job is to like aggregate all the conversations you're having into one place, right? So RSS feeds, YouTube content, Twitter Spaces. We're not really doing Clubhouse, honestly. But but I think the idea is like bring in more and more and more of the stuff that you have going on in all these places, have all the people who care showing up in that one place, and sort of create this like meta layer, a conversational layer around community that may become something longer form, bigger form. That's not our job to sort of like drive it anywhere. Right. Like you want to still have a Discord, that's great. You want to Slack, that's great. But I think if you make content today, but you want to make it participatory, like you call it, right? Like that's what we're helping you do.
Which I think is, not only is that needed, but it's that combination of filtering beyond the noise. It's empowering everyone's voice to matter. And I think the other part of this is also that is essential is like, how do we facilitate conversations amongst our community and our audience, right? Like it drives me nuts that Facebook Live all these years later still does not let you mention someone else that is in the chat that is watching the same video as you. Like,
right.
I understand that the guy on video or woman on video is talking, but I want to have these conversations with the people that are watching alongside of me, right? And like in that kind of that element as well.
Yeah.
I love where you're going on that. We'll put more details in there. We, of course, will share, there's some other things I know you have in the works that I'm excited to kind of get out to our audience. The last thing I want to throw to you, as someone that, advises startups, that has a startup that has worked in this space, startups go through ebbs and flows, ups and downs. You mentioned it, you literally, that's part of the grit that an entrepreneur, needs to have. Well, let's face it, these last couple months for many people, especially NFT crypto space, is the first time they've rolled the roller coaster down. And they're wondering, how do I survive the downside of the roller coaster so that it picks me back up on the back end? What's your approach or advice for those that are listening, that as someone that's experienced kind of all of those ebbs and flows, how do you look at the bear market and keep your head about it yourself, but also just admitting that hey, it impacts all of us. We're not, none of us are, absolutely, we're not, can't avoid a lot of that comes in. But for those that are listening, I know a lot of people are at that spot in their life. What is your approach?
So I think a couple of things. I say, let's be honest, there may not be a recovery, right? For a lot of you, you may just get burnt out and that's it. There are existential things that happen. Everything that goes down does go up, right? The question is, do you have the patience and wherewithal to survive through the time frame that's there, right? So, I don't think it's going to be a short, I don't think it's going to be a very long, protracted sort of dip this time. I think dips get smaller and smaller, as systems mature, right? But it's going to be a while. It'll probably be another year, right? Where we're sort of at least in this, right? Kind of down phase, and I think you've got to realize you shouldn't be in it. If you're in it for the money, then that may be the main reason to eject yourself from the ecosystem. By the way, I would argue that there's actually great amounts of money to be made in these kinds of markets, right? So the number one simplest advice I'll give is that some of the best things that we know of, love now, were all made in downturns, right? Because it forces ingenuity, it forces you to think, it forces you to work with fewer resources, right? It also separates out why you your motivations for being there. Do you really want to see this thing happen, or were you just trying to do it for a quick flip, right? Nothing wrong with a quick flip, by the way, but if that was why you're doing it, that opportunity is sort of narrowed now, right? There's just fewer quick flips that you can do in a bear market, right? I think like weathering it is about like building relationships with people, right? Like reminding yourself of why you want to do something, right? And then resetting the expectations. This is the most important part. Like if you thought you could do something in 3 months, it may be 6 months, 9 months, a year, right? Yeah. And so you just have to get used to the idea that the things you wanted to do likely have a different time horizon. And there also are likely new opportunities that you weren't considering before that you have to like reevaluate like the world through, right? So, look at all the new metas that we've seen like around, like, that's come out, free mints, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like all this stuff was not stuff we did, right? Like literally like 3 months ago, no one was doing any of those things. That's what that inventiveness and ingenuity looks like, is people coming on and saying, well, I could do this. And what happens is their roadmap gets trimmed, or they readjust it, or they reevaluate it. Nothing wrong with that. Right. What's bad is pretending everything's the same, right? And just acting like you're going to get it all done with like 1/10 the money and, like in 1/10 the team and all this other stuff. So if you're not honest with everyone, especially yourself, you will definitely not come out of this well. But if you can be honest quickly, right, and look at every new thing as an opportunity, not as a failure, I think you have the best chance for success.
Oh, love that, Greagarious. I appreciate your friendship. I love, what you're doing in the space. I like being on the journey with you. We message just about every day, most of the time on random NFTs and the world that exists that we're always kind of dealing with. But I think for those that are listening, the other part of this that's like beautiful is like, co-creating, and like you are really great at not only asking for feedback, taking feedback, but like leaning into use cases and ideas that people have. And I know we have a lot of people in this community that listen to the show that they're building something, right? They have a vision, a purpose, and passion. And I challenge all of you that are listening, right? Reach out, Greagarious, like connect those dots, because there's some beautiful synergy there. And, just based on my experience, working with you on some things, that it's been a lot of fun on that journey. So thanks for coming on the podcast. Thanks for, we finally locked this in, and I'm sure we'll talk more, in future episodes around the podcast as well.
It's been a pleasure, and I will see you all soon, I'm sure.
That is for sure. Yeah. And we hung out in person, these in-person events. So if you see, more than likely, if you're hanging out, you're seeing me around, you're going to see Greagarious around as well. We got to do up the town in Miami, which we ran into each other accidentally on the street. Like we had messaged.
That was the first time we met in person.
First time we ever met in person, right? We had been to like the same events multiple times, never actually met in person. Streets of Miami apparently were the magic weapon. But for everyone listening, thanks so much for tuning in. And as always, until tomorrow, make it a great day. Cheers.